Gaijin Entertainment presents The Shooting Range. You're watching The Shooting Range, a weekly show for all tankers and airmen of War Thunder. In this episode, what happens when a shell hits a target? We explain the way armor penetration works. The Douglas SBD Dauntless, never too old for this. Hotline, the developers answer questions that you left in the comments. But first, let's start with combat, takeoff, landing. What are flaps and when to deploy them? Flaps are a type of high-lift device found on the trailing edge of a wing and used to increase the lift of a wing at a given airspeed. It might sound a little bit complicated, but in fact flaps are quite simple to use. Here we're not going to discuss theory or go into much detail. We'll tell you how to use them in combat instead. First things first, do not use flaps at high speeds, they can rip off easily. You have to know the limits of your plane, so the first step is to try to use the flaps on your aircraft at a multitude of speeds. Obviously, the test flight is your friend here. Now for the fun part. Let's take for instance the Ki-84. Get it up to speed of 280 miles or 450 kilometers an hour and go into a tight turn. Let's deploy combat flaps. We turn tighter now. Okay, let's try takeoff flaps. Even tighter. Landing flaps? Still tighter. What's the catch? Why do we even bother with other options then? Imagine, you're in a fight, your opponent is flying the King Cobra and tries to get away in an upward spiral. We deploy landing flaps to get the upper hand in a turn fight, open fire, and then lose the enemy. Why? What happened? The thing is, landing flaps cause a lot of drag and make you bleed energy very, very fast. And no energy means, let's say, a bleak future for your career in the Air Force. That's why it's best to stick to using combat flaps when you need them at all. It is hands down the best option at the speeds above 220 miles an hour or 350 kilometers an hour. Deploy your takeoff flaps only when you desperately need to make an extra tight turn. Landing flaps give you the most lift for the lowest speed, which makes them great for low-speed maneuvers. And the last thing, don't forget to switch back to raised flaps when you're ready to fire. And now, we're getting back to tank armor. We already discussed how the armor is made and what types of armor are there. Now let's see what happens in the game when a shell hits an armor plate. In order to damage any module or a crew member, the shell must first penetrate the armor. We wanted to make armor warfare as interesting and realistic as possible, so we introduced a complex system of damage calculation. To tell whether the shot penetrates the armor plate, the game has three main stages to check. First stage, or breach check. If the shell's caliber is 6 times bigger than the armor plate's thickness, then the shot goes straight through the armor without any additional checks. The second stage is a ricochet check. A ricochet can occur when the shot meets the plate at a sharp angle of up to 50 to 60 degrees. The sharper the angle, the higher the chance of a ricochet, up to 100% ricochet chance during a parallel hit. By the way, the ricocheting shot might damage a nearby tank, be aware of that. Shells can also ricochet inside a vehicle. If no ricochet occurs, then the game makes the third and final check, the actual armor penetration. It involves calculating the armor plate's angle, angle of the incoming shot, and angle of the vehicle itself relative to the incoming projectile. In other words, it involves a lot of complex calculations just to find out how many millimeters of steel the shot must punch through. Finally, the game considered the shot's inherent armor-piercing characteristics to tell whether or not the shot gets past the armor. If a shot penetrates the armor plate, the shell deals damage to the armor, loses penetration value and kinetic damage proportionally to armor thickness, and goes further. At the same time, the penetrated plate creates spall, a cone of shrapnel. If the shell hits an internal module, all the above-mentioned checks are made again, as long as the shell retains enough penetrating power. If the shot doesn't go through, but has explosives inside, then it explodes outside the tank, damaging all external equipment of the tank caught in the blast. Keep in mind that no penetration doesn't necessarily mean that your crew and internal modules are completely safe from harm. Do you remember the time we explained the way HESH rounds work? Or the time when we discussed the flaws of brittle armor steel? In other words, you can still fall victim to the nasty spalling effect. Such calculations are made for all shells hitting any target. Can you imagine how many such shots travel towards their targets each second among hundreds of thousands of players? That's a lot of calculations. And now we're going to discuss an aircraft with an extremely fitting name, Douglas SBD Dauntless. You probably heard the phrase, be slow in choosing a friend, slower in changing him. When it comes to the Douglas SBD Dauntless, it's basically its whole story, but it will come to that later. Ed Heinemann and Jack Northrop designed the prototype of this aircraft in 1935. To put things in perspective, those were the times when aircraft designers were still living in the era of biplane configurations, thick airfoils, and corrugated skins. Against this backdrop, the Dauntless looked like a marvel of science. Just look at this impressive list of features: an enclosed cockpit, retractable landing gear, perforated dive flaps, wings designed for structural strength, a swinging bomb cradle, and a nice fitting out. It was also easy to maintain and cheap to produce. Of course, the aircraft had its flaws. For instance, it didn't have folding wings, or, at the very start, any armor. But all in all, the Dauntless was an offer the Navy couldn't refuse, even in times of financial instability. The second half of the 1930s turned out to be a very busy time for aircraft designers, where new ideas were being tested and put to use one after another. Not surprisingly, in 1939, when the world was at a brink of a big new war, Dauntless was believed to be extremely outdated. The Navy wanted a new, more modern bomber, and the sentiment was shared across the pond. Great Britain and France entered the war and were in dire need of new machines. In the end, almost all American aircraft makers rushed to design their own bombers that could replace the outdated SBD Dauntless and the TBD Devastator. The Grumman TBF Avenger, the consolidated TBY Seawolf, the Brewster SB-2A Buccaneer, the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, and the Vultee A-31 Vengeance. The list goes on and on. The main prize was, of course, the official contract with the Navy, but frankly speaking, there were no losers. The European allies were eager to buy anything even remotely resembling a working aircraft. While the world was being consumed by the flames of war, the US was making a pretty buck selling weapons for both cash and on credit. And it worked quite splendidly, for some time. But then, it all went south. On December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy mounted a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and the US had no choice but to enter the war. The pickiness of the top brass that were quick to dismiss the old dive bomber and the haste at which the aircraft designers were creating new planes led to a surprising result. The Dauntless, that was supposed to leave the scene any day now, remained the US carrier-borne scout plane and dive bomber. It just didn't have an equal. The newest dive bombers just weren't up to the challenge at this point. And that wasn't all. The old Dauntless performed so well that the Navy not only dropped the plan to remove these aircraft from service, but also ordered the manufacturer to work on some new modifications of the well-tried design. Easy to fly and notoriously hard to take down, the SBD is best remembered as the bomber that delivered the fatal blows to 4 Japanese carriers at the Battle of Midway. The old dive bomber lived up to its name. Where waves of the B-17s or the modern TBF Avenger failed, the SBD succeeded. The Marines couldn't get enough of this aircraft. They lovingly joked that SBD stood for slow but deadly. Even though its more modern rivals were subsequently passed into service during the war, the production of this excellent scout plane and dive bomber ended only in 1944. Be slow in choosing a friend, slower in changing him, remember? Finally, it is time for the traditional last part of our show, Hotline, developers answering questions from the comments. Strictly speaking, it's not the most serious-minded section of the show. If you want answers to be given with solemn faces, feel free to appeal to the official forums. Here we have a more lighthearted discussion of the Big Questions of War Thunder. Well, hope you like it. We'll start with a question from a player called Knivesnore. He writes, "You have a very active community of people who love the pilotage missions for training of acrobatics teams. But we're stuck with only one map. Is there any chance we can get more maps?" Yes, we are going to release a few new maps of this type in the future updates. So, keep your eyes peeled. Heck, we're even working on a map with some crazy elevation changes right now. A guy called Captain North America asks, "Will the CDK ever be available to Mac users?" Sorry, Captain, we do not plan to port our CDK to Mac OS, or at least in the near future. Then there's a question from Simon Smola. "Will you add armored cars?" Well, the game already has a few, for example the T-17E2 or the Armored Car Mark II, AA, and we're not going to stop there. Finally, an important question from a player called Stanley Leblatterite. If a destroyer is destroyed, then does that make the destroyer of the destroyer the new destroyer? Hence, the destroyer is no longer the destroyer because it has been destroyed, or does the destroyer remain the destroyer even though its destroyer destroyed it? According to the official Universal Guides to Names, Titles, and Forms of Address, the destroyed destroyer retains the right to be called a destroyer, but has to hang its head in shame. At the same time, the destroyer of the destroyer, or the new destroyer, is considered an honorary destroyer. And them's the facts. That's it for today, but feel free to write your questions in the comments below. We do read them all, and you might see some of them answered in the next episode. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. See you on the shooting range.